I work in this site for many years. These warriors are all life-sized, like real soldiers.
They thought it was just a tomb, a breathtaking tribute to an ancient emperor. But in 2025, scientists uncovered something terrifying beneath the Terracotta Army: chemical traps, toxic defenses, and a warning carved in silence for over 2,000 years. What was once history is now a threat. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. If you love true mysteries and hidden history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell, because what we're about to reveal may change everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. The discovery that changed everything. 1974. I used to think it was just a legend, something passed down in dusty old books or whispered by tour guides to wide-eyed children. But in 1974, that legend broke through the surface, literally. What began as a group of farmers digging a well in the outskirts of Xi'an, China, turned into one of the most astonishing archaeological discoveries in human history. A discovery that would later be revealed to hold more than just statues. It would hold secrets, warnings, and maybe even something much more dangerous. At first, the site was quiet, remote. The dusty countryside gave little clue of what lay beneath. When the first fragments emerged from the earth, what looked like broken pottery, no one could have guessed what was coming. But the more they dug, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary find. Rising from the soil were life-sized soldiers, carved in stunning detail. Not just one or two, but lines, entire formations of warriors, frozen in time. They stood shoulder to shoulder, facing east, eyes locked in silent readiness. Crossbowmen, infantry, cavalry, chariots, generals, each one unique. Their hair, their armor, the expressions on their faces no two the same. Some held weapons, others stood in formation. It was as if an army had been turned to stone in the middle of a drill, and for more than 2,000 years they had waited. The man they were built to protect? Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China under a single rule in 221 BCE. Known for his ruthless ambition and obsession with control, Qin ordered vast architectural projects, the Great Wall, an expansive road network, and, in secret, the construction of a sprawling underground empire. The Terracotta Army, it turned out, was only one part of a much larger design. As Chinese archaeologists continued their excavation, the scale of the project quickly surpassed belief. What was initially thought to be a standalone tomb was, in fact, a massive necropolis covering more than 38 square miles. Ground-penetrating radar revealed chamber after chamber, building after building. But at the center of it all, untouched, was the emperor's tomb itself, the core, the heart, sealed for over 2 millennia. Ancient records spoke of this central tomb with awe and fear. According to the historian Sima Qian, it contained palaces, towers, rivers made of flowing mercury, and a ceiling embedded with pearls to mimic the stars. It was designed not as a grave, but as a complete universe in miniature, one that Emperor Qin intended to rule in death as he had in life. But despite all the advances in modern technology, the Chinese government refused to open it. Officially, they claimed it was to protect the tomb's integrity, that they were waiting for future technology that would allow them to preserve the delicate contents within. On the surface, that made sense. But even then, some archaeologists and historians began to question that narrative. Why so much secrecy? Why no attempt to even drill exploratory cores? What were they really afraid of uncovering? Meanwhile, what had already been unearthed defied belief. The warriors, standing silently in their pits, weren't just sculpted with remarkable detail. They were manufactured. Tests on clay composition and facial structures revealed something strange. The soldiers were built from standardized molds, an early form of mass production. These weren't simply works of art. They were engineered. Even more shocking were their weapons. Many were bronze, but unlike most artifacts of their age, they hadn't rusted. Their blades remained sharp, polished, pristine. Metallurgists analyzing the composition found traces of a strange protective coating, chromium, a substance barely known in ancient times, and unheard of in metallurgy before the 20th century. How had artisans from over 2,000 years ago figured out how to chemically protect their weapons. As these questions mounted, another layer of mystery emerged. Soil samples taken from the area surrounding the unopened tomb showed abnormally high levels of mercury. At first, this was dismissed as symbolic. Maybe the old legends were right, rivers of mercury had been used to mimic the geography of the empire. But mercury is deadly, and these levels weren't symbolic. They were real, measurable, dangerous. So now, the narrative began to shift. The tomb wasn't just a statement of power, it was something else, something darker. What kind of man builds an empire beneath the earth, populates it with thousands of lifelike soldiers, and surrounds himself with poison? 50 years later, the Terracotta Army remains one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. Millions have visited the site, marveling at its grandeur and scale. But few realize that it may also be one of the greatest unsolved threats, because what lies beneath has never been touched. And in 2025, the truth would begin to seep through the cracks, not in myth, not in metaphor, but in data. Cold, terrifying data. And that's when we stopped asking how the Terracotta Army was made, and started asking, what was it guarding? Beneath the surface, 2024. For decades, Pit 1 had captured the world's imagination. It was the most photogenic, the most organized. 6,000 soldiers lined up in battle formation, each one a masterpiece. That was the face of the Terracotta Army the world saw in textbooks and museum posters. But Pit 2 was different. Fragmented, disjointed, less studied, and for a long time, less understood. That changed in 2024. A new international research team combining Chinese archaeologists with scientists from Germany and the UK was granted limited access to re-examine Pit 2. Their mission: to apply the latest imaging, chemical, and structural technologies to an overlooked part of the necropolis. No one expected a breakthrough. Most assumed they would confirm what was already believed, that Pit 2 was a secondary deposit, possibly an unfinished section. But almost immediately, the data told a different story. Among the rubble and partially restored figures, they discovered a larger-than-life general nearly a foot taller than the average soldier. His armor was ornate, his posture commanding. His hairstyle, the classic top knot of elite Qin officers, was sculpted in perfect symmetry. And around him, other figures, mounted cavalry, armored lieutenants, even war horses, frozen mid-gallop. This wasn't disorganized. It was tactical. The team began mapping the positions of each figure, looking for patterns. And they found one. The entire arrangement mirrored a battlefield command structure. The general stood at the center of a flanking maneuver. His cavalry curved to the side. His infantry protected the rear. It was a clay replica of real-world combat strategy, meticulously recreated. But it was what lay beneath that changed everything. As part of their analysis, soil samples were collected from various parts of the pit. The results were disturbing. Elevated mercury levels again. Not just near the general, but in a wide radius around the command group. That alone would have been strange. But this time, it wasn't just mercury. Traces of arsenic compounds. Mineral signatures inconsistent with the local geology. And something else, chemical residues that didn't match any known preservation methods used at the time. It wasn't natural contamination. It wasn't a side effect. It was deliberate. At first, officials downplayed the findings. Summer heat, poor air circulation, stress. But the research team wasn't convinced. They began cross-referencing these chemical signatures with similar data collected in earlier excavations. The results revealed a startling pattern. Wherever the military hierarchy appeared, most structured where elite troops and officers were found, the soil showed signs of elevated toxicity. The theory that emerged was both chilling and revolutionary. The Terracotta Army wasn't just symbolic. It wasn't ceremonial. It was strategic. Not in how it represented a battlefield, but in how it protected one. The toxins weren't byproducts. They were defenses. And suddenly, the symptoms experienced by some of the workers, dizziness, headaches, fatigue, nosebleeds, took on a new light. Several had to be hospitalized. None were life-threatening, but the pattern was undeniable. Especially when temperatures rose, air quality in and around Pit 2 dropped significantly. The hotter it got, the more unstable the environment became, almost like something was seeping up from below. Still, Most of the findings remained internal. Public tours continued. Photography was allowed. Tour guides spoke of ancient glory, not chemical warfare. But beneath that layer of tourism, something more serious was unfolding. Using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging, the team discovered multiple hollow chambers branching out from Pit 2. Some were small, barely noticeable. Others were larger, rectangular, laid out like rooms. But none were listed on historical site maps. One particular zone east of the pit revealed a grid of what appeared to be bunkers, or perhaps storage units. The signal analysis showed high metal content, yet no excavation was authorized. When the team requested permission to drill a core sample into one of the hollow zones, they were denied. No reason was given. That's when the whispers started. Internal reports began using terms like containment risk and passive exposure zone. The implication? That the site didn't just contain relics of the past, it contained active chemical hazards. Ones that had been dormant for millennia, ones that might still be dangerous under the right conditions. The question was no longer, why did Qin Shi Huang build this army? The question became, what was he trying so hard to keep people away from? Some researchers began referring to the site as a deadly museum, a place that preserved history but also punished anyone who disturbed it. The elegance of the sculptures, the careful spacing, the formations, it all served a function. Not just to glorify a ruler, but to repel intruders, to confuse robbers, to control archaeologists, and maybe to contain something. Satellite imagery only deepened the mystery. Thermal scans revealed abnormal heat signatures in areas that should have been thermally stable. Ventilation-like channels ran through the subsoil, indicating air once flowed beneath the surface. Why would an underground tomb need airflow? There was only one chilling conclusion: to move something. Vapor, gas, airborne material. By the end of 2024, the team had collected enough data to suggest the unthinkable. The Terracotta Army might have been part of a large-scale engineered deterrent system. Not a tomb, a fortress. One designed not just to house a dead emperor, but to ensure he remained untouched forever. It was no longer about preservation. It was about protection, isolation, and possibly containment. And as one researcher quietly wrote in his notes, if the tomb has lungs, what is it breathing out? The Deadliest Secret 2025. By January 2025, the whispers had turned into questions. The Terracotta Army was no longer just a marvel of ancient art, it was becoming something else. Something unsettling. For the first time since the site's discovery in 1974, scientists began asking a question no one had dared ask before. What if the warriors weren't there to protect the emperor from the world? What if they were protecting the world from the emperor? A joint research team composed of Chinese, British, and German scientists was finally allowed to expand their soil analysis across multiple pits. Their mission had changed. This wasn't just archaeology anymore. This was a hazardous materials investigation. They focused their efforts on Pit 2 and surrounding areas, taking dozens of core samples from the subsoil, statues, weapons, and even air pockets within the excavation sites. And this time, they weren't just looking for mercury. What they found shook them to the core. Traces of arsenic trioxide, lead, and a refined form of cinnabar, a mercury sulfide compound, were discovered not only in the soil, but embedded deep in the ceramic matrix beneath several statues. One canister, unearthed beneath the shattered foot of an archer figure, contained crystallized deposits that, when analyzed, matched the chemical structure of a known compound used in early industrial chemical preservation 2,000 years ahead of its time. But it wasn't just what was found. It was where it was found. The compounds weren't randomly scattered. They were strategically buried beneath figures of rank, near high-traffic corridors of the necropolis, at ventilation junctions. It was as if someone had calculated where to place each pocket of toxin, to make sure that if disturbed, it would spread in a pattern systematically and invisibly. And then came the chromium. This was perhaps the most confounding discovery of all. For decades, archaeologists had marveled at how the bronze weapons of the Terracotta Army had avoided corrosion. The common theory was that ancient Chinese metallurgists had discovered a secret chromium-based treatment, an anachronism that, if true, would have rewritten the history of chemistry. But in 2025, a new analysis revealed a different answer. The chromium wasn't on the weapons. It was in the soil. Environmental chemists determined that the interaction between underground water, minerals, and the toxic elements in the soil had produced a thin layer of chromium oxide on the bronze surfaces over centuries. In other words, the perfect preservation wasn't a technological feat. It was a side effect of a highly contaminated environment. That revelation changed everything. Because if the weapons weren't treated but instead preserved by the soil itself, then the contamination had to be intentional. The soil had been engineered to be hostile to biological decay and potentially to biological life. That's when one researcher coined a phrase that would appear in multiple leaked documents. The Terracotta Army is part of a containment matrix. One such internal report, which was never officially released to the public, included a diagram of airflow currents based on ground-penetrating radar. It revealed a system of interconnected hollow chambers beneath several pits, all of which funneled toward the central burial mound. Inside those shafts were ancient ventilation ducts, cut from stone and aligned to move air, not trap it. Why would a tomb need that? The only conclusion that made sense: to allow chemical vapors to disperse evenly in the event of intrusion. Suddenly, everything fit together. The sealed tomb, the resistance to excavation, the health complaints, the perfect preservation, the selective locations of toxic compounds. It wasn't just that opening the tomb might damage the artifacts. It was that opening the tomb might trigger a chemical trap. A quiet war broke out behind the scenes. Preservationists called for immediate suspension of fieldwork. Toxicologists urged for wider environmental testing. Some members of the team were removed. Others simply stopped responding to press inquiries. Public tours were scaled back. Access to Pit 2 was heavily restricted. The Chinese government remained silent. But the leak couldn't be contained. An anonymous insider published an excerpt from a scientific summary in a private academic forum. Within days, the phrase "terracotta tomb trap" began trending on archaeology blogs and conspiracy forums. Most dismissed it as fear-mongering, but those who had read the leaked data knew better, because the most terrifying part wasn't the possibility of a trap, it was the design of the trap itself. The more they analyzed the flow patterns and chemical distribution, the more it resembled a weapon, not a deterrent. The system was layered, with redundancies. The toxins were placed with the kind of precision you'd expect from a chemical engineer, not a 3rd century BCE stonemason. The tomb, in essence, was an early form of biochemical defense infrastructure, a weaponized grave designed to punish intruders through time. And it had worked. For over 2,000 years, no one had breached the core. And now that we know what's inside the soil, no one dares to. One expert summarized the situation in a sentence that sent chills through the research community. This isn't a tomb. It's a self-contained death zone designed by a paranoid emperor. By the spring of 2025, the site had gone nearly silent. Tourists still visited Pit 1, but all active digs around Pit 2 and the surrounding network were paused indefinitely. Rumors swirled that international teams were being pulled. Testing was ongoing behind closed doors, but no one talked to the media. The question was no longer whether they would open the emperor's tomb. The question was whether they ever should. And as one Chinese scientist privately told his Western counterpart over a secured line, "We used to think the Terracotta Army was a warning from the past. Now, I think it's a warning to the future." What they were guarding. By the summer of 2025, the Terracotta Army was no longer just a mystery. It was a message. A message left in stone, sealed in poison, and buried beneath layers of engineering so sophisticated, even modern science struggled to comprehend it. The question that had haunted researchers for decades, what is inside the emperor's tomb, had now shifted into something far more urgent. What is the Terracotta Army guarding? The answer began to take shape, not in the tomb itself, but in the space around it. Using high-resolution satellite imagery and new-generation ground-penetrating radar, researchers started mapping the broader necropolis in unprecedented detail. What they found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Beneath and beyond the pits already excavated lay a vast network of subterranean rooms, many aligned in geometric patterns not seen in other burial sites from the era. One area east of Pit 3 stood out. A rectangular formation of buried structures appeared on thermal scans, arranged in a precise grid. The radar return signatures suggested metallic density, possibly sealed compartments, with uniform spacing. They weren't listed on any historical diagrams. No ancient text referred to them. Whatever they were, they had been carefully hidden. But there was more. When overlaid with the known toxin distribution maps gathered from earlier soil samples, a clear pattern emerged. These hidden structures weren't randomly located, they were at the intersections of toxic hotspots. Arsenic here, mercury there. Even lead, used rarely in the region, showed up in trace amounts. It looked like a chemical minefield, and the newly mapped grid sat at the heart of it. Some scientists believed these were delivery nodes, vaults, or chambers designed to store or release substances into the soil. Others theorized they were control hubs, capable of regulating airflow or pressure in the tomb's underground ventilation system. Either way, the intent was unmistakable. Containment. And if containment was the purpose, then the army wasn't ceremonial at all. It was functional. Each general, each infantryman, each archer, they weren't simply artistic masterpieces. They were strategically placed markers, anchors that divided the zone, guarded the channels, and masked the purpose beneath their feet. Like silent sentinels holding the line not against invading armies, but against anyone foolish enough to dig deeper. One figure in particular, located in Pit 2's far edge, drew special attention. An armored officer, mouth slightly open, arms outstretched, not in attack, but in warning. Beneath him, radar revealed a sealed shaft, unusually deep and curved. Chemical analysis of the surrounding earth showed contamination far above any other zone. One German researcher dubbed the area the black lung of the site. They didn't open it. No one dared. And while the media had been largely quiet since the leak of the joint 2025 report, word continued to circulate in academic circles. A second round of anonymous data dumps appeared online, this time containing environmental simulation models. The models depicted what could happen if the sealed tomb was breached. Rapid pressure loss, vapor displacement, and airborne particulate spread mimicking a modern chemical event. But here's the thing. These models weren't created from imagination. They were built using the topographic, geological, and toxicological data gathered from the Terracotta site itself. And they predicted one thing very clearly. Opening the tomb, even partially, could release thousands of years' worth of stabilized toxins in a matter of minutes. At this point, a new theory began to take shape. One that was whispered at first, then quietly circulated in white papers and closed-door discussions. The Terracotta Army isn't just guarding a tomb. It's guarding a containment system designed to hold something inside. Something that can't be allowed out. But what? A substance? A biological hazard? A volatile chemical experiment? No one could say. The records from the Qin dynasty were too fragmented, the scans too shallow, the area too dangerous to test directly. And still, the army stood. Thousands of clay figures locked in perfect formation, immobile and mute but somehow watching. Some researchers began referring to the entire site as the dead zone. Others went further, calling it China's buried Chernobyl. That wasn't hyperbole. Multiple working groups were now lobbying international agencies to treat the site as a historical hazardous zone, no different than an abandoned chemical facility. They called for sealed borders, protective gear requirements, and a formal moratorium on excavation. But the Chinese government stayed quiet. They neither confirmed nor denied the findings. Access remained restricted. The central tomb remained untouched, and the silence became part of the fear. What was clear was this. Nothing in the Terracotta complex had been done by accident. The toxins, the tunnels, the airflow, the soldiers, the metallic nodes, the silence, all of it was deliberate. A system, a message. And as one professor wrote in a paper that was never officially published, what we've uncovered is not a historical wonder. It's an ancient protocol for threat containment. And every part of it says the same thing. Do not enter the tomb no one dares to open. It's still there. After everything we've uncovered, the toxins, the underground networks, the chemical traps, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's tomb remains sealed, unopened, untouched. And now, it's not just because we can't open it. It's because we're no longer sure we should. For decades, the official reason for leaving the central tomb undisturbed was preservation. The concern was always the same, that modern excavation techniques might damage fragile artifacts, or that the air would cause ancient materials to decay rapidly. But 2025 changed that. Now, experts aren't worried about damaging artifacts. They're worried about unleashing something we can't control. After months of internal review, several independent reports began circulating among international academic and environmental agencies. They described a series of anomalies, small at first, but deeply troubling. Tiny shifts in subsoil gas pressure near the central mound, fluctuating heat signatures, evidence of subterranean air currents. In simple terms, the tomb is not a closed system. Something inside is still moving. This shouldn't be possible. The chamber has been sealed for over 2,000 years. Yet, satellite and radar imaging suggested there were still active thermal channels, places where temperature was slightly warmer than the surrounding Earth. Not enough to indicate activity, but just enough to raise an alarm. Then came the phrase no one wanted to hear. Potential volatile containment breach. In one internal document, a risk scenario was modeled. What would happen if the tomb were to be opened suddenly by pressure, by accident, or by force? The model simulated a rapid depressurization event. In plain terms, a chemical backdraft. Ancient gases, stabilized vapors, sealed toxins, all released at once. And if those gases had pooled and evolved over centuries inside a sealed environment, we wouldn't just be disturbing a tomb, we'd be puncturing a 2,000-year-old chemical weapon. It wasn't just speculation anymore. Chinese officials began quietly reinforcing perimeter zones. Excavation permits were frozen. Access to the eastern sectors of the necropolis was halted. Foreign researchers were asked to leave or redirect their efforts to safe zones. And while tourists still wandered through Pit 1, marveling at the soldiers, the deeper levels were being closed off behind closed doors. No official statement was released. No press conference, no photographs, only silence. But silence is its own kind of message. Experts now describe the tomb as a threat suspended in time. A place engineered not only to hide power, but to punish curiosity. Every aspect of it, from the air shafts to the poison-laced soil, was part of a greater design. One built by a man so obsessed with control, he engineered his own immortality not through spirit, but through fear. It's one thing to rule in life. It's another to rule in death. And Qin Shi Huang appears to have done both. Now the debate has shifted. Not how do we open it, but what else is buried that we haven't found? Because recent scans have revealed entire sectors of the necropolis that remain unmapped. There may be more chambers, more traps, more armies, even more lethal mechanisms hidden under centuries of soil. If the Terracotta Army was only the outer layer, then what guards the inner sanctum? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, was it all meant to guard something? Or was it meant to keep something in? In one of the last documents leaked from the joint 2025 task force, an anonymous researcher wrote a single line: "We are not prepared for what's inside. Not now, maybe not ever." Since then, calls have grown for an international oversight body to evaluate the site. Some are pushing for a permanent moratorium, arguing that the risk outweighs any historical gain. Others still want to explore it, believing the knowledge could be worth the danger. But as of now, the tomb remains closed. Not by accident, not by fear, by design. And so the army stands, thousands of statues, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Tourists continue to take selfies. School children sketch the warriors in notebooks. But beneath their feet is something else. Something they can't see. Something they were never meant to find. And the people who have seen the data, the researchers, the geochemists, the field workers they no longer speak with, wonder when they talk about the Terracotta Army. They speak with caution, with restraint, because they know what we almost did, and what we might still do. So now, we're left with the only truth we're allowed to hold. The Terracotta Army was not built to be admired. It was built to be feared, and maybe to warn us. Because if this is what guards the outside, what in the world lies buried within?